It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
That's actually a good point with the real estate agents. There are some suggestions. For example, the flood inquiry here in Victoria from the Maribyrnong River floods. They suggest that actually real estate agents should provide information, so that we require real estate agents to provide that information. Obviously, that means that those real estate agents also need to get that information, but actually to make it part of the selling process. So again, that people can assess their risk and understand what they're buying into.
And that is Annette Kroen in Melbourne on the Real Estate Breakfast this morning. And welcome back to another episode with more of your property insights, connecting you to all of the best real estate information across Australia. Of course, we are here 7 days a week as we talk to all of the important experts around the country. Remember, we are not a real estate company, so we ain't trying to buy you something. You are getting the unbiased knowledge firsthand, and you can stream us at any time on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcast and Amazon. Well, we're back after a weekend into the beloved Monday. February the 24th. Yes, we all hate Mondays. Now, Domain, they did a great piece the other day talking about the massive problem ahead with the constantly changing weather Australia is being struck with. And it's only getting worse for homeowners. Governments must improve buyback processes for homeowners in high-risk disaster areas, as current efforts at the moment is falling short. A new report stresses the urgency of mapping land for retreat and identifying suitable resettlement areas. And with climate change increasing extreme weather events, communities face growing risks, yet buyback schemes often lack transparency and consultation. So this is a big question that we're going to be talking about this morning as we catch up again with Annette Kroen from RMIT University there in Melbourne. And good morning to you, Annette. Welcome to the Real Estate Breakfast this morning. First off, I want to talk about the proactive planning required for these buybacks, because the government often reacts to these disasters with a little bit of ad hoc buyback programs rather than having clear plans in place.
Yeah, thanks, Craig, and good morning. Yeah, that's exactly right. So buyback programs are really an offer for households or owners impacted by disasters who decide that they want to move, so that they don't want to live in that specific location anymore. And then the offer is to buy back that land so that the owner can move somewhere else or relocate. As you said, the issue is often that these programs are ad hoc. So it's a reaction to a certain disaster. And what we argue is that there should be programs or policies in place. Buyback programs might need to be different with different disasters because every disaster is different, but at least to have a common approach so that these programs can be developed earlier after a disaster has hit. So that's one of the things that we argue for. So there could also be buyback programs before a disaster has hit. So if an area is identified as high risk area, there could be offers to homeowners to actually relocate.
Yeah, that is so true. And let's actually turn our attention, Annette, in Lismore, because the buyback process, that as an example, has been slow, uncertain, and it does leave many homeowners in this limbo that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right. So there has been a buyback program. There is the Resilient Homes and Resilient Lands program from the New South Wales state government, also Commonwealth government. So this is already great that there is that offer, but the issue was exactly that you need to find land where people can relocate to, and that has been a slow process because, we all know that there is not a lot of land available for development. This has taken quite a while. That meant that property owners who actually wanted to relocate had to wait for their offer. And that's obviously quite hard when you've just experienced a disaster. You have decided you want to move away, but you don't know what will happen. So that's really impacting households even more. And again, that's why it would be so important to have some plans ahead so you can actually work quicker with that. I have to say, though, that most stakeholders we talk to in the Lismore area are totally supportive of that buyback program. They all think it's a great idea. It's just really the issue of implementation where then, it gets slow and people, it's about 3 years now and people are sometimes still waiting.
Yeah, it's a very frustrating time period for people because of that limbo process. As climate change increases the frequency and also the severity of these disasters, long-term residents often underestimate future risks based on past experience. The whole raising awareness, improving access to risk data and a whole lot of other things is going to, I guess, help people just to understand that this is not something that is retreating at the moment. Underestimating these disasters is a really bad starting point.
Yeah, again, so in our research, we talked to stakeholders working in this area, and a lot of them said that this is really an issue. Obviously, local knowledge is also important because people understand, if we are talking about flooding, they understand the river. But because of climate change, actually a lot of the natural hazards or the events become more impactful, and that's where sometimes past experience doesn't help. Again, we have seen that in the Lismore floods. I actually was there at that point in time and we stayed in Ballina and people told me, we get never flooded. It's usually Lismore. And then the next day there was flooding. So this really shows where we have this experience, but it doesn't count anymore. And that's why we need good data, updated data assumptions, and also the same assumptions. So that's sometimes the issue with flooding studies, that different assumptions, for example, in relation to warming or something are taken, and then that obviously gives different results. So for one thing, we need good data, the same assumptions, and then really this making them public so that people can actually have a look and understand what their risk is and then prepare for it or decide if they still want to live there.
Yes, we're talking with Annette Kroen there in Melbourne this morning, talking about flooding. We'll come back in just a moment with more.
From first-time home buyers to seasoned investors to breaking property news. Discover the stories behind the real estate.
And right now it is time for another property tip. A few weeks ago, we were talking to Brent, an auctioneer in Adelaide. He's joining us again this morning. And Brent, auctions are often unpredictable. Question for you is, what's the biggest mistake people make when things don't go as planned? For example, if their initial strategy, it falls apart or the bidding surpasses their budget.
The biggest mistake that people make in that situation is they back off, they're defeated and deflated, and then all of a sudden have got a negative opinion around bidding again at auction. You've got a game plan, stick to it to the best of your ability, then go to the next auction and the next auction, because eventually you're going to win the auction and buy the property that you're after. But continue with confidence. You may not have had time to execute your game plan on that particular auction, but your time will come.
The Real Estate Breakfast is on the streets finding out what you think about the current market conditions.
And it is a Real Estate Monday, talking flooding, unfortunately, in Australia and some of these severe events that are taking place. I just want to come back, Annette, to these words, which I think are very frustrating for people when they hear it, and that is a 1 in 100 year flood event. We've talked about that on the podcast before. I wish people would actually stop saying this now, because, you can have 2 events or even 3 events within the time frame of 2 years, and that should be 300 years years, not 1 in 100.
You're exactly right. And I remember there was this great heading, what is a 100-year flood event and why does it happen so often? Yeah, we need to change the language here. And again, I think in this sector, there's awareness of that we need to change the language. It's probably just a bit slow. And probably the reason why we're still using that is that it's kind of easier to understand than a lot of the other technical terms. It's just that for some of those floods, we don't know anymore if it's a 100-year event. It's probably more likely to be every 50 years or, as you say, even every second year now. So yes, we definitely need to change the language around that.
And also, just sticking with this 1 in 100-year event, we had somebody telling us about an agent that sold a property, told the buyer it was a 1 in 100-year event. The property had been on the market for 12 months. All the locals knew that that was in a bad area, but this person just didn't drill down and do enough due diligence, which is a really frustrating part of the process where some of these properties are identified as flood risk.
Yeah, that's actually a good point with the real estate agents. There are some suggestions. For example, the flood inquiry here in Victoria from the Maribyrnong River floods, they suggest that actually real estate agents should provide information, so that we require real estate agents to provide that information. Obviously, that means that those real estate agents also need to get that information, but actually to make it part of the selling process. So again, that people can assess their risk and understand what they're buying into.
And governments, they spend more on post-disaster recovery than on proactive measures like relocation and home modifications, which, again, that kind of mindset needs to change, doesn't it?
It does. One reason that we are spending more money on response or on the recovery, obviously, is that it is quite expensive. So you need to rebuild infrastructure and everything. So that's why it makes it more expensive than putting money into disaster risk reduction. The other thing why sometimes government is a bit hesitant is, for one thing, it's politically sensitive. So a lot of people or politicians don't necessarily want to talk to people about relocating because it's a sensitive issue and it's an emotional issue. The other reason, obviously, it's probabilistic. So you don't know whether a disaster happens. So sometimes I think there's still the hope that it won't happen and all will be fine. And that sometimes then also it might be a bit harder to argue for funding, because you want to show that you're spending your money well. And if people then say, well, we spent all this money on this disaster risk reduction, but nothing happened, then I guess some politicians might be afraid of being seen as spending money on the wrong side of things. Although, yeah, as you said, it's definitely putting money into disaster risk reduction is so much more worth than responding. And obviously also it avoids a lot of suffering for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is such a big subject that we are covering this morning. Well, thanks for shining a little bit of the light into that corner for our listeners, Annette. And coming on to the Real Estate Breakfast, enjoy your Monday today.
Yeah, thanks. I will do. You too.
From interest rates rising, a shifting landscape, rentals running hot, clearance rates, a tight rental market, buyer-vendor sentiment. We cover it all every morning from 6 a.m. on the Real Estate Breakfast.
And our data showed that the younger you are, the higher your expectations are. So Gen Z feel like you need at least $177,000 to be on a good salary, whereas the kind of baby boomers at the other end of the scale, they're closer to $126,000. So they see a much lower amount as being, the necessity that they need for a good salary.
The most sensitive markets to cash rate changes tend to be in Sydney and Melbourne, and they tend to be pricier parts of those cities as well, potentially because people have to go into more debt to buy into expensive markets.
Absolutely, and I think there's a proper war for talent in our industry. We need more good quality people joining the real estate industry at every level. Our industry is often misunderstood around the roles and responsibilities of what we do day to day, and we don't do a great job of educating people on how to get started and what they need to think about. You do need to think about the size and the scale of the organisation that you're joining and whether they have those systems to allow you time to learn.
We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.